Ford handed their best driver a win, then took it back. Not Ferrari, not a mechanical failure, Ford. And the man they did it to was the same man who built the car that beat Ferrari in the first place. That's the Ken Miles cover-up. And if you think you already know this story from the movie, you don't know half of it. Ken Miles wasn't a factory golden boy. He was a British ex-tank commander, born in Sutton Coldfield in Birmingham's industrial heartland, who showed up in California in 1952 with grease under his fingernails and an engineer's brain that most racing drivers could only dream about. He'd left school at 15 to apprentice at Wolseley Motors, served through the war in a tank regiment, and arrived in America with nothing but his tools and an opinion about everything with four wheels. The American racing crews called him Teddy Teabag, for the obvious reason, and Sidebite, because he talked out of the side of his mouth. He had a Brummy accent thick enough to cut glass and a sarcastic streak wide enough to get him fired from almost any corporate job you could name, which is precisely why he thrived at Shelby American, where Carroll Shelby's standing rule was, if it doesn't work, take a hacksaw and cut it off. Miles became Shelby's chief test driver in 1963 and immediately started delivering results nobody else could. He won 14 straight SCCA races in a car he designed himself. 14. And when Ford came to Shelby with the GT40 problem, specifically a car that handled like a shopping cart above 170 miles an hour and kept destroying itself before the finish line at Le Mans, it was Miles who went to work. He tested the GT40 at Ford's Romeo Oval in Michigan and lapped the 5-mile circuit at 201 miles an hour. That single lap convinced Ford executives the Mark II was race-ready. He fought Ford's engine and foundry division over carburetor design and won. He spent midnight after midnight in the workshop while other men were sleeping, because that's who Ken Miles was. He wasn't racing for the glory, he was racing to solve the problem. To understand what 1966 meant, you have to go back to 1963. Ford had tried to buy Ferrari outright, deep into negotiations, both sides ready to sign, when Enzo Ferrari walked away at the last moment over a clause that would have given Ford financial control of the racing operation. The old man wasn't selling his soul. Henry Ford II took it personally. He told his people to go to Le Mans and beat Ferrari's ass. That was the brief, that was the budget. The first 2 years were a disaster. In 1964, all 3 GT40s retired and Ferrari swept the podium. In 1965, Ford doubled their entry to 6 cars. Every single one failed to finish. Ferrari won again, 6 consecutive Le Mans victories for the prancing horse, and Ford had nothing to show for 2 years and millions of dollars except a pile of broken gearboxes and a very angry board of directors. By 1966, the pressure was enormous. Ford brought in Holman and Moody alongside Shelby American, sent 13 Mark II GT40s to France, and told everybody involved in no uncertain terms, this is the year. The 427 cubic inch V8 was punching out 460-plus horsepower. The cars were clocking close to 200 miles an hour down the Mulsanne Straight. Ferrari had the P3. It was going to be a fight. But before Le Mans, Miles went to Daytona in February and won the 24-hour race with Lloyd Ruby, wire to wire, first overall, then Sebring in March. Miles led, Gurney pushed him hard through the night, and at the very last corner, Dan Gurney's engine died. Miles slowed so Gurney could push his car across the line and claim the points. That's the measure of the man. 3 wins in a row, Daytona, Sebring, and now Le Mans. Nobody had ever done it in a single season. Nobody. The Triple Crown of endurance racing had never belonged to one driver in 1 year, and Ken Miles was 2,000 miles and 24 hours from making history. June 1966, the Circuit de la Sarthe. Miles qualified on pole and drove from the front from the start. The Ferraris challenged through the night, but the GT40 Mark IIs were simply faster and more reliable. By hour 18, the last serious Ferrari, Lorenzo Bandini and Jean Goucher's P3, gave up with a water leak and clutch failure. The race was Ford's to lose. And Miles, sharing the #1 car with New Zealander Denny Hume, kept pushing anyway. When Beebe ordered the leaders to slow to 4-minute laps, Miles was still doing 3:38s, 22 seconds faster than instructed. Shelby reportedly threatened to pull him from the race. Miles eventually settled into the pace, but there was a lot of race left, and he'd built a cushion of 34 seconds over the #2 car, Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon, with just the final hour remaining. Third place, the #5 car, driven by Dick Hutcherson and Ronnie Bucknam, was 11 full laps behind. There was no race left. Ford had won Le Mans, and Ken Miles had his triple crown. That's when Leo Beebe got involved. Beebe was Ford's racing director, not an engineer, a PR man, and watching 3 Ford GT40s strung out across the final hour of the greatest endurance race in the world, he saw something he wanted more than a clean result. He wanted a photograph. He wanted all 3 Fords crossing the line together, bumper to bumper, a living billboard for the Ford Motor Company. There was a pit stop late in the race where Miles's #1 car had to come in. Wrong brake pads, the team said. That pit stop cost Miles his 4-lap lead and let McLaren rejoin on the same lap. Some people at the time believed that stop was no accident. Miles himself reportedly felt that forces inside Ford were not particularly interested in watching him make history. Then the order went out over the radio: slow down, let McLaren and the 3rd car catch up, give us our photo finish. Miles knew exactly what this meant. He wasn't naive. He understood the Le Mans rules better than most of the officials running the race. In a tied finish, the winner was determined by total distance covered, and because the grid positions at Le Mans are staggered, the #2 car driven by McLaren had started 14 meters further back than Miles. A dead heat finish would hand the win to McLaren, not by racing, by parking lot arithmetic. Miles slowed down anyway. There are different accounts of what happened in those final laps, and we may never know exactly what was said between Miles and the pit wall. What we know is that he complied. The man who had built the car, developed the car, won the 2 lead-up races, and led Le Mans wire to wire, lifted off the throttle so a Ford PR man could get his picture. As the 3 Fords formed up on the final straight, McLaren, furious about the pit stop situation and not about to come second regardless of team orders, accelerated hard before the line. He crossed clearly ahead. Miles and Hume were behind him. Chris Amon later said something to the effect that Bruce sure as hell wasn't going to come second, and when the officials applied the distance rule, the result was official. Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon, winners of the 1966 24 Hours of Le Mans. Ken Miles, who had driven more of that race than any other man on the circuit, finished second. Miles said afterward, "Thus ends my contribution to this bloody motor race." And separately, when asked how he felt, "I'm disappointed, of course, but what are you going to do about it?" That second quote is almost worse than the first. That's a man who's swallowed something deeply unfair and decided there's no point in fighting it. Carroll Shelby later said he felt the decision was wrong. Ford's top brass got their photograph and their headlines. The headlines read, "Ford wins Le Mans," not "Ken Miles makes history," just Ford, the company, the brand, the machine that had used Ken Miles to build their machine. Here's what makes it darker. Miles wasn't just robbed of a win, he was robbed of a record that still hasn't been matched 60 years later. No single driver has ever won Daytona, Sebring, and Le Mans in the same season, not once in 6 decades of endurance racing. That record should belong to Ken Miles. It was his. He earned it 3 times over. And then, just 59 days after Le Mans, Ken Miles was dead. August 17, 1966. Riverside International Raceway in Southern California. Miles was testing the Ford J-Car, the experimental bread van prototype successor to the GT40 with radical new aerodynamics and an unproven honeycomb chassis. It had already claimed one life earlier that year when Walt Hansgen crashed one at Le Mans during test sessions in April. Miles knew the car was unproven. He went out anyway, because that was his job. After a full day of testing in the Southern California heat, Miles approached the end of the track's 1-mile downhill back straight at over 200 miles an hour. The car went wrong. It flipped and disintegrated. The exact cause was never definitively established, but the aerodynamics, the very thing the J-car was supposed to solve, were implicated. The car generated less downforce than expected at speed. At 200 miles an hour, less downforce is a death sentence. His son Peter, 15 years old, was at the track that day. He watched it happen. Peter Miles has not returned to Le Mans since 1965, the last time he was there with his father. Ford quietly redirected the J-Car program after the crash. The redesigned version, strengthened chassis, revised aerodynamics, renamed the Mark IV, went on to win Le Mans in 1967. One positive came from Miles's death. Steel roll cages became standardized in sports car racing afterward, a safety improvement that saved Mario Andretti's life in a crash at Le Mans in 1967, and has saved countless drivers since. Miles didn't get the credit while he was alive. He got it in the rulebook after he was gone. There's a reason this story took decades to fully surface. Ford had every incentive to keep the narrative clean. They'd beaten Ferrari, they'd conquered Le Mans, and they had a dynasty to protect. The inconvenient truth that they had cheated their own best driver out of the most historic single season in American motorsport history didn't fit the brochure. The 2019 film brought Miles back to mainstream attention. Christian Bale's portrayal caught something real about the man's character, the stubbornness, the integrity, the refusal to be anything other than exactly what he was. But the film softened the edges. The reality was sharper. This wasn't a bittersweet Hollywood moment. This was a corporation placing a press release ahead of the man who made their victory possible. Ken Miles was inducted into the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America in 2001, 35 years after his death. It's the right recognition, long overdue. But it doesn't change what happened on that Sunday afternoon in June 1966. The GT40 that officially won the 1966 Le Mans sits in museums. It gets celebrated. The man who built it, who bled for it, who won every race that mattered that year, got second place, a bitter quote, and 59 more days on Earth. Some wins aren't measured in trophies, and some losses are the most revealing things in the history of the sport. If this is the kind of story we should be telling, the real ones behind the headlines, hit subscribe and join us.